topic for today's conversation is world building, and I'm gonna hopefully be able to talk about some things I've learned in the last 12 or 15 years, and things that might be helpful for you if you're developing games or telling stories or playing role-playing games. I've got unfortunately comprehensive notes that make it actually very hard to talk from. So I'm going to skip around and try to remember everything and keep a steady train of thought. Once I'm through, I'll open it up to questions, which is probably going to be sooner than later. So I'm going to introduce myself. My name's Jason Souls. I'm the lead designer now for Privateer Press. I'm in charge of Warmachine, Hordes. I'm the co-creator of Unhallowed Metropolis. And I'm the lead designer and co-creator of the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game. I've been with Privateer for 12 years this August and been running Warmachine since we released it. So hopefully I know something about what I'm talking about. At Privateer, we take world building incredibly seriously, and immediately from the onset realized that we were not developing a world for a miniature war game. We were creating the story of a world at war. And that's an important distinction because it enables us to take what we create and translate it into a number of other media. So if we want to do a fiction line, or a film project, comic book, video game, music, RPGs, all those things we can go back to the same world and draw from, and we have. We've attempted, to one degree or another, all those different media types I just mentioned. To some degree of success, more than others. The video game project we have on the way, Tactics, which is due out this August, is probably the third or fourth translation of the Iron Kingdom setting that we've attempted to do in a video game form. Some of which you've heard about, some of which you probably haven't. So, when you think about your worlds as a designer, don't limit yourself to the immediate and obvious applications for it. Keep the details in mind and build a world that's as realistic as possible. If it's real to you, you can do anything with it. I've jumped ahead, you see. So the key is to create an immersive world, a world that can draw in your audience and that they can buy into. It's always going to come down to the willing suspension of disbelief. If your setting has an internal consistency and you see it and you can describe it, you can pull people into it. And the more you can pull your players into it, and anybody who digests what you're creating, the more that the more they'll be invested in it. Am I talking in circles? I'm going to skip to the end of my notes. So I think there's two very important things to do. One is you want to create a rich and detailed history. A history that goes back far enough that the present is real for you. Because the characters that occupy your world, which are absolutely as important to your setting as the lay of the land and the broad strokes cultures you're introducing. Your history informs the attitudes and the direction of your characters. And you want to provide something rich and compelling that your players can dig into, that your audience can dig into, and that they can understand. Your history is going to be the eyes into the world. It's also key to making your characters seem real. Everybody needs their motivations. Every character needs their motivations. And the history is going to inform the societies and the cultures and the civilizations, and those things inform how your characters move through the world. There's going to be a lot more about that, I hope. The other thing is you don't want your world to be so detailed that you haven't left room for people to play in your sandbox. You want to make sure that there's room to tell, that people can use your world to tell their own stories. But you also want to leave some contradictions. For instance, if you're developing a creation mythology for your world, consider several different viewpoints on it and leave an opening where people can make decisions and think it through for themselves. Because if you have contradictory creation myths even, then your players will have to make decisions. If they make decisions, they're invested. It's kind of an easy way to bring people in. So, you want a world to be as detailed as you can get it, so that it's real in your head. But you don't want it so bogged down with superfluous details that is boring to read. I'm realizing that I'm thinking about this from the point of view of a role-playing game developer, that when I pick up a setting book, before I see rules, I like to read through a couple hundred pages of history and setting. Once I fully digest what the writer has in mind, I think the rules make a lot more sense, because the setting and the style of game that you want to create should inform the rules, as my general philosophy. So at Privateer, we've overwritten every role-playing game book we've ever designed. When we first started working on the original D20 Iron Kingdoms books, I think originally we decided to do a 120-page setting book. And that quickly evolved into a 400-page setting book. And then it turned into 2 400-page volumes of setting in order to get across what we were looking for. Matt Wilson, my boss, created the world and turned it over to a number of developers who started generating all this content. And that was in the works when I came on board. And I immediately had access to this 800 pages of background material that was still being developed, and I had to trim it down to something digestible for a war game. So we started off with sort of a parallel development, and the role-playing game designers were developing the D20 content while I was writing with Warmachine. And they got out their first 400-page book, and it was the original Iron Kingdoms character guide. At the same time, I was getting Warmachine out. And the process working on the second 400-page book, which was the world guide for the setting, and they had created this world in Amber, which means that they were telling the story of a world at peace without motion to it particularly, and without thoughts to the sweeping characters. I can't say without thought to the sweeping characters. They were just the 1,000-mile-high view where you have the kings and the gods and the entities that were more ideas than living, breathing individuals. Process of working on Warmachine, we identified early that it was going to be a story-driven game. And in order to have a story-driven game, you need characters to tell the story. Which means you have politics, and you have shifting borders, and you have open wars. So I took their 400-page book that was written in its motionless state and suddenly had to apply motion to it. And basically, I took their world and set fire to it. And then I had to describe all the unfortunate things that happened to the cities that they had developed painstakingly. Poor Doug Seacat took 3 years writing that book, and I had to say, that's a fantastic city. This is what it looks like after the shells start falling on it. Yeah, it was a good time. I don't have a great sense for what you all exactly would like to know, and what exactly, I have a good idea of what I can tell you, and I think that I want to turn over the conversation to questions sooner than later. Is that all right? All right, we're going to do that now. So, who'd like to ask a question? Yes. Oh, I have a box for you. Done.
Thank you. When you started building the Iron Kingdom world, where exactly did you begin?
Thank you. That is a wonderful question that should have been in my notes. So the Iron Kingdom started off 2 or 3 years before I came to Privateer. And Brian Snowdy and Matt Wilson were the initial 2 creators of it. And it was at the start of, right after D20 first released, and Wizards of the Coast opened up the D20 license and started allowing out-of-house developers to create settings and to write scenarios in Dungeons & Dragons world. So they began working on what became the Witchfire trilogy, which was the story about Alexia and the infernal sword, the Witchfire, and her adventures, and a story of a Scorn invasion through the Iron Kingdoms. Along the way, they started generating a lot of setting material. The first Witchfire book, I think, had 30 pages of setting material in it, and the subsequent 2 scenarios just kept broadening and increasingly making the setting more broad. And they got a lot of interest in it. The scenario books were very high quality, great artwork, and they were wholly unlike really anything on the market at the time, and people really enjoyed them. So Matt continually wanted to push things further and started to work with freelance writers to flesh out the world. And that's where the idea for the initial setting book came from, that went from 120 pages to 400 to 800. And I have to be honest, it wasn't really 800 pages. It was like 1,200, and we had to keep cutting and cutting. So Warmachine, Hordes, all grew out of the initial D20 line. And we've gotten continually better about portraying the world the way we want it. And we knew fairly early on that translating the Iron Kingdom setting into somebody else's rule system wasn't precisely what we ever wanted. So we very early on intended to write our own role-playing game system, which is what became the Iron Kingdom's role-playing game, which we released 3 years ago. But that was probably the 3rd or 4th version of that game that I wrote. And the only one, we sometimes invent the wheel and keep hammering away until it's exactly what we want, which sometimes means that I have a lot of work on my shoulders. So finally we got the game we wanted and put it out there. Hope that answers your question. So next question. You'll be next.
I wanted to ask, while creating a world, how do you make sure that the world is original enough to be interesting, but not so original that it would be weird or would seem like it's trying too hard?
It's a really good question. I don't think a world can be too weird. I'll start with that. It's not that the world's too weird. It's that your characters, which is the point of view that you get into the world, you need characters that your audience will buy into and that they'll invest themselves in. That's the window, and the weirder you get, the characters are the window in the world. If you can understand the characters' motivations and you like the characters, then you will understand the world. I think Dune is a fantastic example. That's an incredibly weird world, but I think the characters will draw you in. And I mean, giant worm messiahs aside, there's something comprehensible even of the strangest things. So, question here. Yeah, down there.
Yeah. How do you keep track of all the interactions and objectives of a character or characters? So you have a multitude of characters that have been living or are living now, and do you keep like a physical track or just try to keep everything not colliding and collapsing on themselves?
That's another good question. We have a privateer. We have 3 primary minds behind the setting: Matt Wilson, Doug Seacat, and myself. Matt creates the broad strokes, and Matt creates the titanic, world-shifting stories. What interests him is the real motion that drives the world. Doug tracks everything systematically, painstakingly. He knows when every single character was born. He knows where they were here and there. I mean, he's the one who keeps the copious notes of every little thing. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I rely on my memory more than anything else. And when I don't remember something, I dig. And Doug is our head writer, and so he reviews other people's stories and he can do content checks, but I tend to be our gopher for details on a systematic basis. So the way we do it is we have 3 people who basically track various aspects of it, and one of the interesting things is that we don't always agree. And we have different ideas and interpretations about how some things have worked, especially if we've only discussed them or have discussed them in a limited way, and we've only covered them in broad strokes. There's always room for interpretations, which I remember I have a note in here about not always agreeing. If you're working with a team of creators, you don't need to agree. In fact, you shouldn't agree on every detail. And you shouldn't, again, it's back to don't be afraid of contradictions. Your worlds are bigger than you, or at least they should be. You want to give that impression. And if you have multiple people working on something and they have different viewpoints, if they have different viewpoints, you can have that come out in your descriptions of the world, and provided that they aren't a full stop contradiction that weakens the overall world, it again gives a point where your audience will read through and stop and start thinking about these things. Not everybody has to be right, and not every character knows the full scope of what's going on around them. Next question. You back there.
You said that you think that the setting should inform the rules. What do you lose, like in the context of a role-playing game, if your setting is completely divorced from the rule set that you're using?
Sorry, say the last part one more time.
Like, what do you lose if your setting is completely divorced from the rules that you're using?
What do you lose? I think you lose being able to shape the rules to the experience you want to provide. I think that on one hand, you should be able to translate your world into virtually any media, which means virtually any rule set. But the rule set will drive how the game is played, which is how the experience will be shaped. So if, for instance, you want to tell a survival horror game, then you want more serious fear mechanics. You want to build suspense. You probably want an element of mystery. You never want your players to feel safe and at ease. You constantly want to build the tension and to build the threat level. So hit points or anything along that concept that abstracts damage is going to be less useful than a system, for instance, where a gunshot causes bleeding, and bleeding has to be treated before death comes. And the rules will build the experience that you want to provide. So you could tell numerous types of games in the same setting, but I think that if the rules are quite generic, you lose out on the ability to shape that experience. Next question. I'm gonna start pointing. Yes. Luckily, that thing's soft.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned earlier about the first Iron Kingdom setting being very set in amber, is what you describe it as, and then you had to put it into motion. And what can you please tell some more about that, and any like problems you should avoid? You know, don't break things too much, or something like that. Like, how do you set the world on fire and do it right?
All right, that's a good question. It's all about the characters, and again, I think that's the easiest thing to misunderstand about designing a role-playing game. Because when you design a role-playing game, specifically, you're creating a sandbox for people to play in, and your thoughts are very often providing locations and a type of event that a way your characters are going to function, and what the characters in your setting are going to do. But if you don't think about the politics, and the politics do not evolve, you don't really have a world. You have a stage waiting for somebody else to build a world for you. So even if the player characters never interact with the characters driving the world, those characters need to exist, and you need to know who they are. You need to know their motivations, and you need to know their trajectory. And again, as you're getting people, you need to know your audience, and you need to provide them with characters that make the world immersive. When you're writing, for instance, your setting material, it's great to describe everything in broad strokes, but sometimes you need the worm's eye view. You need to know what the little people think, and you need to get inside their heads, because they are going to define what the tone is. Then you need to know what the top of the world is like, and the rival factions, and the rules they play by, and what they're willing to do. And you make decisions about how much control and how much influence the player characters are going to have on the setting. If the player characters are playing, for instance, a noble house, and you're pitting them off against other noble houses, they're going to have a more direct influence on the politics of the world than if they're a bunch of mercenaries fighting somebody else's war. So again, it's back to the experience. You want everything meshing together. You want the rules, the story, and the experience all working together, which you need to plan, which as a game creator, you need to plan out. And that 1,000-mile perspective I mentioned earlier, that's another layer to the onion. If you want players to have a grunt's eye view and to be involved in the wars, it's going to be very personal, and they're going to have a very small impact on the whole world. But if you're spending the time to develop the whole world, you might as well develop it thoroughly enough that if you wanted to translate into a board game where it's continental conquest, you still have an idea of how to translate it, how to make it feel like your world. So it's always about keeping the perspective that you want for your game in mind, as well as keeping things broad enough to generate the content to make it all real. It needs to be real to you. I realize that's slightly beyond the scope of your question, but there we are. Next question? Yes.
One thing that I've had issues with is creating cultures from the start, because cultures can be extremely complex and overwhelming to create yourself. Where would you start?
Wikipedia. Do your research. I co-wrote a game called Unhallowed Metropolis, which is the gas mask chic role-playing game of neo-Victorian horror. It's a zombie Victorian game set in the wilds of London 2105, 200 years after the zombie plague breaks out. And my co-writer Nicole Vega and I ended up probably spending the first 5 or 6 months reading and taking constant notes and bouncing ideas off of each other. And if you ever get the chance to see the bibliography of that book, it's pretty intense, and a lot of research went into it, and a lot of painful research went into it. I never want to read another book of spiritualism again under any circumstances. But we didn't really know anything about Victorian London aside from knowing that we liked what we had learned previously. But we immersed ourselves in as much history as humanly possible. I mean, I read 2 books on cholera in London and how the city of London, which is the square mile at the heart of London, which is different than Greater London, and the details are immense, as it turns out. And you are never going to totally understand your subject, so you have to fake it. So Wikipedia is a good start. It'll at least give you an inkling as to what you don't know and give you a start in a direction to start figuring it out. So when you're designing, back to your question, when you're designing a culture, you need to know the broad strokes of what you want out of it. Think about the aesthetics. Think about the type of people that you're trying to design. And then you need to build a history for them. You need to make them make sense, which is, it's the hard part is, well, it's also the fun part. is adding that consistency to it. You need to know what shaped them and how they got to where they are. And again, you don't need to know everything, and you won't. You just need to make it real for you, real enough. So when I'm designing a civilization, I'm stopping to calculate what I can say precisely. I've got a lot of notes. The Iron Kingdoms, I keep starting and then realizing that what I'm about to say takes a little bit more explanation. The Iron Kingdoms, as I've referenced, which I'm not entirely sure everybody knows what I'm talking about, is the setting for Warmachine and Hordes. It is roughly the size of Western Europe and takes less than half of our one continent we've ever shown, which is Imran, which is on a world called Kane. And in the last 12 years, we've barely scraped the surface of anything that isn't on Kane. We've mentioned a continent called Zoo, and for various possible future projects, I've had to start designing what I think Zoo might look like, which it has not yet been vetted by my partners, and so whatever I'm about to say is open to interpretation and will be changed, so please take it with a grain of salt. But I had to design some cultures for Zoo, and began looking at what could be there, what we've said about it. And the first thing I did was stop and think about civilizations that I don't know anything about. And I began digging into Taoist Chinese mythology and starting to play with some of those elements. And they won't be recognized as such, but that was the basis for it. And it's sort of, there's some very interesting elements there. And so I took this necromancer society and just sort of merged them together. And there were elements there that were exotic enough that I realized that nobody had, that I had seen had done it before. And so I wanted to play with it. Now, whether my boss is going to buy into my Chinese occult desert nomad necromancer civilization demon plague survivors, I don't know. All right, I think I managed to get that out by sufficiently vague that I won't be fired. So, next question. Or is it? It's going back there, but you'll be next, because I realize I keep looking forward, I keep scanning the sides, and so you're next, you're first.
Well, okay, so this kind of relates to the earlier question, but how do you deal with setting blows? And I mean, is there such a thing? Is there too much information? And how much do you worry about, I mean, not having too much information to convey to players?
We never worry about too much information. We worry about undigestible information. We worry about presentation. But as I said, we tried to write a 120-page book and end up with 1,200 pages of content, of which we published 800. And a good portion of those last 400 pages keeps coming up in our work anyway. So I've heard criticism that sometimes it's hard to get into, say, the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game because the first 96 pages of the book is setting material. And that can be a hurdle for some players that want to sit down and play immediately. I recognize that. It just runs directly contrary to my own philosophies on game design, so I ignore it. I'll be honest. We also, though, our marketing guys strive to take what is occasionally, I'll admit, an unwieldy proposition and try to explain it to our audience as to what they're going to get. And we provide more simple explanations that can get somebody into the game immediately. So I think on one hand, the key is to have a marketing department, but barring that, understand what your players are willing to do for your game. They shouldn't have to read 96 pages to play. So provide cheat sheets to give the broad strokes if that's an issue for you, which sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. So I guess do as I say, not as I do. So you're next. Damn good thing that thing's soft.
Okay, hi. Back to the civilization and cultures for a bit. When you're basing things on real life and real mythology, do you ever get worried that you might be getting too close to the actual real thing and make it seem a bit too mundane? Is this something you actually think about and worry about? Make it a little bit too recognizable and too mundane?
Mundane isn't a problem I think we've ever had. We write fantasy worlds where there's dragons the size of aircraft carriers. So the fantastic elements are going to drive it, but what sometimes we worry that an idea isn't fully baked. It's not fully, it's too real world. Gas there. It's too much of the real world and not enough of our setting. So we haven't done our job thoroughly enough. And Matt Wilson is especially sensitive to it and ferociously points it out when he feels that way. So everything's vetted, and it's going through filter after filter. I realize I'm talking too much about our process. If you feel like, as a designer, that something is too common or too normal, too ordinary, make it extraordinary. Figure out how to make it yours and how it fits in. As long as it fits in, it doesn't matter. And there's so many ordinary details in your settings that you can't get away from. For starters, people eat, they drink. You're going to assume a great deal about how all that works. That's the most mundane of actions to start with. But that's probably not what you're going to tell your story about, unless you're writing a cookbook. So if you're writing a game set in Greece, in ancient Greece, for instance, you're going to draw a lot on the mythology and hopefully as many history books as you get your hands on. But you want to make sure that it's being presented in a way that's compelling and unique. And that's really the most important part. You can take ordinary elements, it just needs to fit into your setting, and it needs to not drag down your setting. Does that answer your question?
Well enough.
Great. So next question. Back to the, yeah. In lieu of a beach ball.
Thank you. Any tips and points for creating pantheons and religion for your setting?
Yeah. I've just actually started to get a handle on this a little bit, I think. And I've been working with Doug Seacat for years, and Doug's had what I think is a much better grasp of the big picture than I have had until very recently. And I think the key, that question is so very large, so I'm going to organize my thoughts for a second. I think the key to designing a pantheon is that it needs to make sense. And you need to understand the role of the gods in the world that you're developing. Are they an abstract concept that sometimes bleed into your world? I'm kind of thinking about the new Battlestar Galactica. Or are they a force that is very real and compelling in shaping the world that you're creating? Are they one of the predominant forces that determine the fate of men and the wars being fought? In the Iron Kingdom setting, we identified very early on that there was to be no atheists, that the gods were real, they manifest power on Cain, and that they were chiefly interested in acquiring souls for their war in the afterlife. And that if you are a follower of a god, then you had not only your fate on Earth, on Cain, but you had your fate in Urkane, which is our afterlife. And for the Iron Kingdoms, we very closely tied the gods to the races, but not, I think, in an ordinary fantasy way. Humanity has really 4 gods. There's Menoth the Creator, who is a fire and brimstone Old Testament angry god, who is the creator of humanity. And they said when Menoth walked the world, his shadow, men came out of his shadow. But humanity turned away from Menoth at some point, being an angry, vengeful god that he is. And there was the ascension of 2 demigods, Maro and Thamar, who are... I'm really going over the top with your question. Anyway, we identified that there was going to be Menoth, a creator god, and then we realized there's going to be these demigods that arose that showed humanity another way, and the cult of Menoth split. And then we introduced Cirrus, which is a god of engineering and mathematics, goddess of engineering and mathematics. And as humanity keeps evolving to these various stages, gods reveal themselves or come into being, and it's a dramatic change that adds a huge wrinkle to the history and the direction of the world, which happens in the real world when a new major religion catches fire and changes the way humans act. At the same time, there's all these other gods that belong to the other races, and all these creation mythologies are interwoven, and each of these different gods and their cults have different ways to view the world and different ways to view where they came from. So they're contradictory, which I think adds some degree of verisimilitude because nobody in our world agrees on where anything came from. If I'm going to save that thought for a second. The other important thing that we realized that I'm going to go back to Doug on is that Doug understands that a god's a god, and that human interpretations of the god is the basis for religion, especially if the god is real and undeniable. Then the god's going to have cults, and the cults aren't all going to agree. And we say Menoth is the creator of man. We had to sit back and say, what does that mean? Because we've only identified this small continent, but we know it's a big, broad world, and there's other things out there and other civilizations out there. But, for instance, they have never heard of the Protectorate of Menoth, or the Old Faith, or any of the things that we've introduced in the Iron Kingdom setting, or Warmachine, or Hordes. So the Argoth came from somewhere. How do those guys think about Menoth? And I realize not everybody knows what the hell that meant, and I'm not going to elaborate for those who do. Just something interesting to think about. So, you not only have to think about your pantheon of gods, you have to think about how your living, breathing people think about them. And then you need to think about how they think differently about them. Religion's a great motivator, and disagreements about religion is a pretty good driver for events in the world. That's when you're developing the history and the backgrounds, keep in mind the misunderstandings, the petty wars, everything that makes it feel real. The Inquisitions, the Crusades, every dirty detail we went through, your world should have a shadow of, if you go to that depth. Next question. Gonna have to point at somebody. All right, clearly you have a question. Oh, you have a question. All right. Sorry to put you on the spot there. Just had to make sure we knew how serious.
So, gods are undeniably real in your world, and what is the optimum level of realness? They're not god kings that rule castles, and they don't apparently kind of slap people around directly with their own hands. What is the optimal level there?
That depends on your world and what you want, the story you want to tell, and the experience you want to provide. I've written games where the gods are real enough that in the Iron Kingdoms, magic and technology exist side by side and are often indistinguishable. And magic, after a fashion, is a science that's it's fantastic, but mundane in the sense that there's industrial magic and that it's used in business. And it's used in warfare where you absolutely want predictable outcomes. So magic is a technology. Miracles manifest occasionally as magic, meaning that they're almost indistinguishable from magic, almost indistinguishable from the technology of the world, which means almost mundane. Still extremely powerful, extremely supernatural, but comprehensible, and you know what your god's going to provide. And if you can work magic and you can call upon your deities to fuel your power, you know what's going to happen. The gods, however, have their limitations, and as not to turn this into a theosophical conversation, particularly about the metaphysics of the Iron Kingdoms, which we have not previously revealed, I'm going to steer back and say that I've also created Unhallowed Metropolis, which is a game in which the gods have absolutely no effect, aside from occasionally one's faith provides them with a bulwark against terror and insanity, that your faith can make you strong, and in turn can assist in your survivability. However, don't expect your deity to manifest in any way, shape, or form. It's just praying makes you feel better. But that's the setting that we wanted to create there. I think one of the very first Wizards of the Coast products was a game where you got to play deities. And so that would be taking things to the furthest extent. I think the Amber game is a fairly similar concept. I'm not sure I'd call those characters gods, but you get to play an immortal with an intense array of powers. So it depends on what you want to do. There's no right or wrong answer. It's the experience you want to provide. Next question? All right, we're going. So you first, you'll be second.
I just had a short question about one thing you said there. Do you actually have the metaphysics of the Iron Kingdom setting actually planned out internally, even if you're not willing to talk about them?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. I was just a bit curious about that.
I'm going to talk for one more second on that. I realize yes may not be sufficient. We think about all aspects in a tremendous amount of detail, much more than I necessarily, as I say, necessarily think, but no, we love the world so much, and it drives so much of what we do that we think about it all the time. And we just went through and wrote the Kings, Nations, and Gods books. And this is by way of saying the metaphysics are very large and very important. And we need to know that interaction in order to understand the limitations of what the gods influences in the world. However, on the more mundane side, Doug and I and Simon Berman, who also wrote that book with us, began discussing the industrial capabilities of the Iron Kingdoms, the legal systems, the differences between the Ghidoran legal system and the Signaran legal system, the differences in how the lawyers perform, who provides the lawyers. We discussed the systems of punishment and what offenses get you flogged, which ones get you drawn and quartered. But these are still, this is still a level of detail that doesn't even scrape the minutia that we dug into that book. And we had people reading through Kings, Nations, and Gods who informed us at some points that this was the most boring thing they've ever written. And so we ended up losing some detail, which is also important. You can love your setting so much that you get bogged down in too much minutia. And so have somebody who is sober read your work and remove those elements. Sorry.
Okay, this is a sort of beginner question, but how do you come up with names for stuff and keep them consistent for different cultures and families and locations?
Names are a nightmare. Names are a nightmare. I'm going to talk about names in two different capacities because they are very important. The broadest strokes of naming conventions. Once, as you look into a culture, you're going to decide on, hopefully, you should decide on the methods of address, the structures of naming, really what existence, unless you have a linguist working with you who's going to develop a language, thinking again about Game of Thrones Dothraki, what's going to happen is probably you're going to bastardize an existent language. And I have done terrible sins, grievous sins, to probably a good third of the languages known to humanity at this point. Grab your cultures, take your cultures, grab a couple different languages, and start mixing and matching them and altering words, and hope you aren't called to task on it too very often. I understand some German speakers want to have a word with me once or twice. So make it internally consistent. Know what sounds right in whatever language that you intend your audience to read your game in. The aesthetics of language and names for a world setting is probably more important than accuracy, in my opinion. You again, unless you're going to create a language whole cloth, you want to create something that feels suitably exotic to suit your culture, while also feeling unique. So looking at say, the Iosians, the elves, and the Iron Kingdoms, I started with a list of names that I had inherited from one of our other developers, and it took me the better part of 3 years to realize that they were bastardized Welsh. Once I got that down, everything fell into order. We stopped pretty much using Welsh because we ran out of words that were comprehensible to an English speaker. But it was good to know. When, I won't go through all of them, but when it comes to naming your characters, anything that's going to be a property that you're going to, say, copyright or own or wish to really protect and use and develop in the future, naming those characters is a lot more difficult, and a lot more difficult than it probably seems. There's only so many words in any given language, and you're going to step on your own toes as your world gets bigger. More importantly, you're probably going to step on the toes of your competitors. So when we sit down to name all the characters in the new Warmachine or Hordes book, we argue quite incessantly between DC, David Carl, Doug Seacat, Matt Wilson, myself. And as I said yesterday, we all have our favorite names, and we argue and we push our favorites, and then finally we hammer together an outline for all the names of all the characters in the books. And then that list goes to Brent Walder, the Dream Killer. Brent takes our list of names and he starts doing a search to see how they've been used by other companies in our categories, and starts crossing them off the list, sentencing us to another 20 or 30 hours of arguing about names, which are getting occasionally more and more exotic as we lose, the easier ones. It's very easy to get more and more exotic names, but it has the unfortunate effect of when you go into a game store and hear somebody talking about your game, they're almost speaking a foreign language at every table, bastardizing what you think the proper name for that character is. So comprehension is also important when thinking about names. So next question. I was looking over here. I was giving you guys a chance. Yes.
You at Privateer are quite brilliant at telling stories and the history through the characters of your world. And can you tell something about that? Do you usually plan a story or a war and drop a character of yours there? Or do you think it of that way, that what if this character goes there, what happens? Is it one way or the other?
We're extremely character driven, and there's two real types of characters that we introduce. There are those that have an arc that we define from the start, and we might not know every detail, but we determine the trajectory and where that character is going to go. And then there's characters who are either side characters that are less important to the overall story, or they're not going to live through the end of the story. So when we want to tell a story, that's what we hammer out first. Some characters will come into it as a matter of course in telling the story, but we plot and plan. At this point, the process is that when we create a new anthology book, which is how we release new models, at the same time as we're figuring out the model content, Doug Seacat is already starting to write an outline for the story and to plot out the major characters and the direction of the story. I'll take a step back further and say that the current story that started with Mark II has been on an arc that we identified, I think 6 years ago now, that we're still running on. And it was, the larger your story and the further back you're planning it, the vaguer it's going to be, and it'll more or less crystallize when you actually start to have to create products. So we do plan out everything in tremendous detail, and we think about storytelling in, that's worth talking about. We take storytelling much more seriously than most people in our field do. And we think about script writing and structure to stories. And there's regular reading lists that if you end up in a development creative position, you're expected to read Hero with 1,000 Faces, you're expected to read Save the Cat, you're expected to read a couple marketing books. But even if you're not a storyteller primarily, which I am not, in my capacity is more broad strokes. But I handle our setting, obviously. And if you're working in a creative place, you have to know storytelling backward and forward, and you have to be able to talk about it. And not just for the sake of understanding where the story is going, but for the sake of understanding how to create compelling characters. Always goes back to that, because your characters are how your audience is going to view the world. That's the window. And I'm going to keep beating that one. It's not the most obvious thing when you're developing for a game that your characters are always going to be important. If you're developing a board game or a card game, clearly not the same case. If you're developing a role-playing game, you need to know what your characters are doing. And you need to know you have to have characters, not the ones that the players are playing, but the ones shaping the world. And the ones that will give the insight into your world. Next question. I hope I answered your question.
What do you feel are the absolute worst mistakes of world building, or the greatest pitfalls, and how do we avoid them?
Wow, all right. I think there's two really big ones. I used to spend a lot of time, I'll start by saying, in nightclubs, and my occupation was pretty well known to my friends and acquaintances, and I'd go to drink and dance and end up talking shop, which I do love, for many, many hours. And so I heard pitches for a whole lot of ideas for games and settings, and so I have identified what I would consider not the best thought out concepts. I think the two biggest pitfalls are not doing your research and not truly understanding what it is you're talking about. I mean, it's one thing to continually tell a story in the Dungeons and Dragons setting that you developed when you were 14 years old, and that could be great and fantastic. And it's another, let me finish that thought, to develop it as far as you need to go dungeon delving and to throw threats at the player characters and make a compelling player character centered experience. It's another to create a world that somebody can pick up and can tell their own stories in and create their own character driven stories in. So do the research and the legwork to flesh out your setting. And know when it's baked. Do all the thinking. Understand all the little things, and don't stop until you do. Make it real. Stopping before it's real, you will have something that doesn't ring true. And if you don't know when it's real, and believe me, that's possible. You lose yourself in your creation, and sometimes it doesn't make sense, and you need another set of eyes and somebody to say either, I don't quite understand this, or, yep, you're off the deep end. Have somebody review it. Have somebody you trust help you get back on course. Or, oh, also, have a good editor. Yeah. As a world builder, get a harsh editor. Get an editor who will tear you apart, who will call you to task, and who will remind you if something looks like a cut and paste from Wikipedia. That's important. Because if you take shortcuts, you want an editor to tell you to stop. Next question? Yes. Wait for the box. So glad that thing's working again.
I think one thing that people screw up, and even very large companies screw up, especially in video games, is a smooth exposition to the world you've created. In writing it can be easier, but I don't know if this is your area of expertise especially, but how do you smoothly introduce a gamer to a world?
Yes, that is not my area of expertise. I specialize in the hard construction, and really I specialize in sitting down and writing 90 pages or 100 pages of background. And writing rules. And writing art descriptions. But I have a marketing department behind me that takes my incomprehensible stacks of pages and produces something that we can use to introduce a new player to. When Simon Berman came on and started working on Unhallowed Metropolis for us, one of the first things he did was start to distill down the, I think, 90 pages of background setting material that we had in the start of the book, and cut it down to 3 or 4 pages that are easily digestible. And I think the key there that Wizards of the Coast has gotten really solid at, and that Paizo with Pathfinder has gotten really good at, is creating introductory products and introductory scenarios with enough detail that you feel like you're getting the experience, and you get brought into these very fast characters to use, which we've also adopted these methods we've also adopted these methods with the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game. That makes getting into the setting far easier, and then you can read the full background at your leisure, really. And when we first did the initial Iron Kingdoms World Guide and Iron Kingdoms Character Guide back in 2003, 2004, I don't think we had any easy-to-get-into materials. If you wanted to know what the Iron Kingdoms was about, you were going to read 400 pages, damn it. And in retrospect, we've gotten a lot better about that. There are certainly hurdles to having a fully fleshed out world. And it is important to keep in mind how easy it is for the guys who want to sit around, have pizza, and play the one night they have this week, an easy road into your game. Which it took me a long time to admit and to say out loud. So there it is. Next question? Somebody over here? Nobody over here yet. Somebody. Okay.
And thank you.
Yeah, about pantheons and gods again. Let's say that Iron Kingdoms doesn't have a lot of gods. Maybe, well, if you count Skyr and stuff, maybe like 10 or so. And then there's the other side, like D&D, that has maybe 100 gods. But there's this, well, not a battle between good and evil, but there is good, neutral, and bad. And do you feel that you have to have the whole spectrum of good, evil, bad stuff, or do you feel that you can have only the good or the neutral or the evil gods for a game to be like good or playable?
I think that depends on the experience you want to provide. And I've seen games that very compellingly have stuck to more of a black and white world perspective. And I think the inclusion of neutral waters that down. That gives you the capability of having gray characters, but it's not really necessarily true to the world. I think that there are places for a black and white setting. Personally, they've never particularly interested me. I prefer, and again, this is coming from a storytelling background, characters that grow, evolve, have the freedom to make good and bad decisions, and that have complex motivations and complex natures. If the character is being driven by your world as a non-player character, their decisions should be shaped more by their background and ambitions than the word good or evil. I think that you want to be able to understand your characters, and the concept of a binary alignment system is a good shortcut, again, if you want an easy road into the game. You're a good guy, you're a bad guy. But that's not good for storytelling, and really not good for storytelling. There's you get into, on some level, the psychology behind all this, and you get into what you want, the stories you want to tell, and the experience you want to provide. I keep going back to those. So even with good and evil, you're going to get stuck with interpretations, occasionally unpredictably. But you also can run into some interesting situations when you're trying to play. If you consider the lifeboat scenario, where you only have so many spaces in a lifeboat, you have to make decisions about who's going to get on that lifeboat. Or decisions about sacrifice, or the sheer mathematics of survival, where are you willing to sacrifice, are you willing to take one life to save many? And I think that there's ways to view those questions. Well, there's a sort of person who can look at all those questions and they're black and white. But that's not really the case. And the more you can dig into human nature and to make that a part of your storytelling and to make that a part of your games, the better. And really, alignment's not a world building question, because that's it's more patina. It's the experience of the game. It's a rules question. But whether or not to use alignment and how to use alignment is a storytelling question. And identifying that, I think, really understanding what that means is very important. And if I'm not being clear, let me know. I like characters as long as they are comprehensible, as long as you understand their motivations and how they move and why they're doing what they're doing. I think you want to give characters a room to be good and bad from time to time. I'm going to assume there's a couple people in here who have watched Game of Thrones. So if you think about the character arcs in that story, there's many very terrible characters that are occasionally very likable. And if the clear message there was that good exists independently of evil and the two never shall meet, aside in something called neutrality, whatever that means, the story could not be as elaborate as it is, but it's a story about politics and human nature, albeit in an entirely fantasy world. I think that that's a really good example of a world that every character is gray or has the capacity to be gray. Sansa Stark being a very good example. So that was my overblown response to your question. I hope it answered it. Next question. I'm going to wrap up. There we go. Yes.
Well, I've been wondering if you, when you create a world, do you think about details like how the tectonic plates move and how the sea currents affect the temperature in some places and like details like that? Do you, because you have been talking about characters and character-driven stories a lot, but when you start creating a world, do you think about details like that?
Yes and no. Yes, you have to on some level, because you need to know what makes sense. And I'm going to take a step back. What you're looking to do with your worlds is create something that's real to you and as real as possible to your audience. And you're seeking to create verisimilitude, the illusion of truth, not truth. You will find that things are more important either because of your prejudices and interests, or they'll be more important because they're actually integral to your setting. I think that taking into account tides and tectonic plate shifting can be very important. And I would do the research into it if it was going to have a bearing on the shape of the world and the experience I'm trying to provide. Now, I say this fully realizing that whereas I don't generally do that, there are very many things I do go overboard in because they interest me even if they don't really interest any of my readers. So in the process of working on Kings, Nations, and Gods, the Iron Kingdom source book, I ended up reading a book called, I forget, it's Doomsday something. I don't remember what the title is. But it's a book written by an English historian that tracks land use in England from the Romans through 1972. And probably I read the 300-page book and it impacted a total of 2 sentences in that entire book. But now I understand land use in England from the time of the Romans. Not particularly important to that book. But what I'm speaking around is if you've ever looked at the Iron Kingdom's maps, there is a giant continental crack running right through the continent where water is spilling at both ends from the ocean. That wouldn't really happen too very long. And there's rivers kind of running into an L shape, which from the sea. Oh, and then down. What I'm getting at is that whoever designed that initial map, I'm being recorded. Hi, Matt. Whoever in the process of developing the Iron Kingdoms map, possibly our cartographer should have done a little bit more research into the way rivers function and how tributaries work and where they originate and where they don't. So it's important to know what you don't know and important to know how it's going to affect your world. So, yes, those things can be quite important. I hope I answered your question as truthfully as I am capable. Next question. Yes. Again, it's great that thing's soft.
Okay, so my question is about afterlife and riding or not riding it. I understand it depends on the experience you want to create and so on, but when and how?
Could you phrase that one more time? I'm sorry.
Okay, so in my experience, when afterlife is written, clearly so when someone dies, soul goes wherever it goes and so on.
Mm-hmm.
It very often makes character that's less important. They don't feel as important because, okay, the soul moved on. The character might as well move to another town.
Mm-hmm.
So when and how to write afterlife?
Okay. Your question has a lot of nuances to it for me. I think that if your game has religion, not the capacity or the reality or the role of the gods in your setting, I think if your world, your setting, has religion, you have to understand the religion and you have to understand what is believed about the afterlife. If the afterlife is part of your game, meaning that it's both real and something that your players can interact with, I think you have to have a much more fleshed out afterlife than if you don't. White Wolf's Wraith is an incredibly important afterlife as your characters are ghosts. So it's important to know where they're going and what they're going to see. For the Iron Kingdoms and Warmachine, Hordes, the afterlife is still an abstraction, although it is an incredibly important concept to understand the motivations of characters and the gods. Our afterlife is a state of war, where Menoth is the god of humanity, is actively trying to, a theory might be that Menoth is trying to destabilize the physical world and drive wars in order to produce better warriors and commanders so that upon their deaths in combat, they'll move on to Urkane and those souls will be of higher value in his great war. And there's something that can compel characters, player characters and non-player characters, the ones that the world builder creates. There's something important, both their motivations and their beliefs and what they want. The afterlife in the Iron Kingdoms compels the characters in a lot of different ways. There's a savage race called the Scorn, which are kind of these very harsh, almost Bushido following, well, they're monsters, but they have no gods, which they're fiercely proud of. However, they also have no afterlife. And when a Scorn dies, his spirit is sucked into the void where, well, it's a nightmare place. And they're not entirely sure what happens, but they're pretty sure it's pretty bad. However, they've developed a system of magic and necromancy to preserve spirits in stone, and their mystics can speak to their ancestors. And so their terror of the afterlife forced them to create new technologies and in turn influence their traditions and has guided their civilization. And they speak to, they're very angry elders from very many centuries previously. Other races, the Iosian, our elves, suffered a terrible catastrophe when they attempted to create something called the Bridge of Worlds, where they were going to physically bring their gods from the spirit world to the physical plane. And because they wanted to live beside their gods, because they love their gods so damn much. What they didn't realize is that they didn't really understand all the metaphysics, physics, nuclear catastrophe that was going to befall them when they attempt this experiment, and it ended up destroying a couple of their gods. That's a rough translation of what happened, but their desire for nearness to their gods caused them to attempt the impossible, and they suffered handily for it. So the afterlife is a motivator, and I think that I can't imagine really what it would take to create a setting that compelled players to think that because there's an afterlife, their lives were meaningless unless half the game takes place in the afterlife, which sounds like a fairly interesting concept. Does that answer your question? All right. So next question. Yes.
Okay.
I don't just go to extremes of sides, so I get a chance to take a breath, but don't not do that.
This is about characters. If there's so many different kind of races and stuff, so how to make a motivation for the player characters to stay together for the adventure? Or is it something that players should think while creating characters, or how do you create the motivation?
I think that there's two ways to look at that. You can look at why characters operate together from the perspective of game developer and world builder, or you can look at it from the perspective of the game master running the play event. I think that as a game developer, well, I have been of several different minds on that. I have created games where there was no reason why characters of various backgrounds would actually operate together, thinking this is somebody else's problem to figure out. And I worked on games that, with my boss, where we take into account things that I ordinarily would say, yeah, whatever, much more seriously if it's important to him. And so, when developing the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game, we looked at very seriously why characters of distinct backgrounds would work together. And we ended up creating some fairly broad adventuring company rules, which can give a broad strokes background for why diverse parties play together, or why more specific parties play together. But I think really that's a question for the person who's running the game. Sometimes telling a story you'll want characters from a diverse background, either a Dirty Dozen sort of storyline where these rough heroes from disparate backgrounds are thrown together for a particular mission, or it's desperation. We're currently working on the follow-up to the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game, which is called Unleashed, which is going to be our Wilds game. And the races in that book are bog trogs, which are fishmen, gatormen, you can see all those guys working together, humans, a little weirder, Nis, which are our wild, more wintry elves, trollkin, pigs, pharaoh, which are pigmen. It's real tough to figure out how to get a pigman and a gatorman in the same group and not have those guys, one of them thinking bacon and the other one thinking I don't want to be bacon. Feel like I'm missing like 3 more races. But that one was tough. Oh, Thorn are in there. But we really had to stop and think about the storytelling. Well, and the fact that it's possible to just play that game and eat other villages, and that's just fun too. But we realized that what we were creating was a game about survival, and that you could have mixed parties playing together, mixed characters of all sorts of backgrounds, races, and hunger dispositions. If the threat was sufficiently real to force them to put aside their differences and tastiness. But I think at the end of the day, it's what's the story, what's the game? If we're talking about a role-playing game party, it's what does the person running the game want? And if they can piece that together, then that's a great background. But if they want all the characters to have come from the same place, then that's something that's going to be harder to figure out. Does that answer your question? I wasn't sure either, so I'm sorry. Next question. Anybody? Are we done? All right. In the meantime, I'm grabbing more water.
Okay, I play with Scorn, and I wonder, how did you create all those beasts in the world?
Trying to remember. That's what that pause is. That's slightly specific, but I'll happily answer it as you have a question. So we sat down to write the follow-up game to Warmachine, which is Hordes, which is the warlocks controlling their bands of war beasts game, tabletop war game. And we knew from the start that we wanted to involve the Scorn. They were previously major antagonists in the Witchfire game, and they were almost the 4th faction in Warmachine before we realized that giant monsters didn't quite fit the steam-powered magic automaton vibe. So first thing we did is sat down and said, okay, we're going to pull all these monsters out of the Witchfire, and those are going to be the war beasts for Hordes. And then we sat down and looked at the artwork that we had generated and realized that they would not make good miniatures. So we immediately started redesigning them, and we knew we wanted big, fierce, scarred monsters. And I think there were war elephants, giant lizard-like war elephants in the Witchfire, with howdahs on top and cannons sticking out of them and things. And that wasn't quite the Warbeast aesthetic that we were going for, so we ended up creating 4-armed, 2-legged elephantine monsters, which are our titans. And we started thinking about what would be smaller, and I think where we've come from since has been somewhat more interesting than where we started initially. I think that there are a whole lot of conversations, and we really had roles we wanted to fill when developing the game. I guess it's a game development, not a world building question. But since then, we've gone back and looked at a rich supply of monsters that we've created for a bunch of different games. And things that were at the Monsternomicon that we realized were perfect for the score, and just insert a couple paint hooks and call it a day. And so we've started releasing some more of those monsters. How we continue to develop them is we think about an aspect of the world, or an aspect of the fauna that we haven't seen, where I'm not going to lie. We, for instance, think it'd be great if we had like a flying pterodactyl-like thing that would fly out of the sky and pick people up and then drop them to their deaths. Yeah, let's make that. And so that's where a lot of those come from right now. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. If you have to boil down to a single point in world creation from nothing to finished thing, what's your absolute favorite point in creating a world?
The start. My methodology, which I think I think that was a methodology question. I'm gonna take it as such. I start by, when I'm creating a new world, I start by generating short essays on different aspects of the world and just write in everything that comes into my head. It's not from a research background, it's from mostly aesthetics, mostly what I mean, if you're gonna write a game, something interests you and you have an inkling for what you want to write about. So that means you have ideas. And I think the most important and fun part is getting out all those initial thoughts as fast as possible, usually in almost a stream of consciousness sort of way. When I wrote Unhallowed Metropolis, I started off by writing, I think I wrote 13 essays, and I had a live journal account at the time with 7 or 8 of my close friends on it who had access to it and just commented as I'd post things. So I threw it out to a sounding board, and I rapidly got a sense of what wasn't concrete, and rapidly a sense of what I knew nothing about. But it was fantastically rewarding. And I think that the next step is doing the legwork and doing the research. And research is interesting, and I love it, but it's not creative, and it's creative in that you have to know what you're going to pull out of it. You do your research. But it doesn't drive your mind the same way. And once you have all the research, then you have to take those essays and try to remember where exactly you started, and then you're working. And you're translating things, and you're building, and you're refining, and you're building, and you're refining, but it's not the same fast and fiery spark that you start with. And I think that those great first brush strokes are my favorite. Next question. I think we're done. Thank you all for coming. I hope I was comprehensible. I have another question. Too early.
What is your opinion about, so to say, creating a historical game world? For example, I'm working on a 16th century game in Kurland, just across the sea, and Latvia has a situation that there is nearly no historical records, very scant information. But in other countries, I know there are also some historical games. And so there's on one hand it's easier taking just the facts, but in the other you understand?
Oh, it's a great question, and I have experience with it. Despite saying I wrote a zombie apocalypse horror game set in a science fiction future London, Unhallowed Metropolis is deeply historical. And the idea is that we took Victorian society and projected it 200 years in the future. Clearly not historical there, but in order to do that, we took our subject matter very seriously. Because when you start to dig into historical games and historical settings, you're pretty much responsible for taking your subject matter seriously. I mean, you need to know where you're going to be divergent, and you need to know where you can play with it. But if it's going to be historical, you have to know your stuff, which means do all the research, understand your subject to the highest level you possibly can. When we wrote Unhallowed, wow, I mentioned we studied cholera outbreaks. We studied cholera outbreaks because we needed to know how the Victorians responded to medical emergencies and the degree of technology they had at the time and likely outcomes. We also looked at industry, crime statistics. We read what, I forget the name of the famous book, but we spent 6 months just studying every available broad strokes piece of information available until the society made sense to us, until we thought we had a basis we could translate for the setting. So if historical game, do all the research possible until you have a firm grasp of it, and then know how to translate it, and if you're going to diverge from it, know precisely where, how, and why. I might be able to say something more specific, but does that answer your question?
Just an additional question. Which is easy? Total fantasy world or historical one?
Total fantasy world is by far the easiest. You create more whole cloth, and there's a lot more details to fill in, but nobody knows if you got it right. And nobody, I mean, really, if it's real to you and you can present it to your audience in a way that they understand, the facts are yours to create. But when it comes to historical, you have to be concerned about people who know the subject as well, and they're going to know what you got right, and they're going to know what you didn't. It's hard, and in writing Unhallowed, I relied heavily upon a British military historian and school teacher, a religious philosopher, a linguist versed in 7 languages. I had a radiologist for the New York City morgue. I had a geneticist. This is much more than anybody needs. I just had to access those people. But I took the material seriously, and in every step of the way, my Frankenstein medical rules were written by somebody who very much understood precisely the weight of the organs she was describing. Any other questions? All right, thank you for coming.
Ropecon.